The FBI agent had always lived a quiet, normal life. He worked hard, kept to himself, and enjoyed the peace of his suburban neighborhood. But one morning, everything changed. A phone call shattered the calm. $1 million heist had taken place, and the most shocking part, it happened right in his own neighborhood. At first, it seemed like any other case, but as the investigation unfolded, the agent realized the truth. This wasn't just another robbery. It was personal, and it was closer to home than he could have ever imagined. The agent now had to face the reality that the very community he called home was hiding secrets, and one of his own neighbors might be involved. The agent's mind raced as he thought about how to approach the case. Investigating a crime in his own neighborhood wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. Every move he made had to be calculated. He couldn't afford to raise any suspicion among his neighbors. They knew him as the quiet, hardworking guy down the street, and that's exactly how he needed to stay. He couldn't risk anyone knowing what he was really up to. If his neighbors found out he was investigating the heist, it could blow his cover and ruin everything. The agent had to balance the need for answers with the constant pressure of keeping his true intentions hidden. Every conversation, every glance had to be carefully controlled, all while trying to uncover the truth. It was a game of trust, deception, and time. The pressure was mounting with each passing day. The agent had to keep up the appearance of normalcy, but inside, the weight of the investigation was heavy. He knew the longer the case dragged on, the greater the risk of suspicion growing among his neighbors. They were watching, and he couldn't afford to slip up. Every time he stepped outside, he had to act like everything was fine, like he wasn't secretly tracking down a criminal who could be living right next door. But the clock was ticking. The pressure to find the perpetrator was relentless. The agent had to dig deeper, gather more evidence, and piece together the puzzle, all while maintaining the facade of being just another neighbor. The tension was unbearable. He had to stay sharp, keep his cool, and make sure no one saw the cracks forming in his perfect disguise. The stakes were higher than ever, and the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. The agent knew that the key to solving this heist lay in the smallest of details. At first glance, the crime seemed straightforward. $1 million in cash, stolen from a wealthy home in his own neighborhood. But the more he dug, the more he realized that nothing about this case was as simple as it appeared. He started his investigation by revisiting the scene of the crime, walking the streets, and pretending to be just another neighbor, taking a casual stroll. The agent's eyes were trained to pick up on things others might miss: an abandoned cigarette butt by the curb, a window slightly ajar, tire tracks leading away from a house that didn't seem to match the rest. Every detail mattered, no matter how insignificant it seemed. He made his way down the quiet suburban streets, pretending to stop and chat with neighbors, but his mind was elsewhere, constantly analyzing. There was a pattern to everything, a rhythm to the way people moved, the way cars parked, the way shadows fell at different times of the day. The agent couldn't afford to overlook any of it. He studied the movements of his neighbors, looking for anything out of place. A neighbor who'd been acting a little too friendly, a car parked in the same spot every night. These little clues started to form a picture, one that didn't quite add up. The agent's pursuit of seemingly insignificant details took him to every corner of the neighborhood. He'd stop by the local park, pretending to enjoy a cup of coffee, while keeping a careful eye on a house across the street. The same house that had once been quiet and peaceful now seemed to be hiding something. He noticed the garage door had been left open at odd hours. The agent's instincts told him that something wasn't right, but he couldn't yet put his finger on it. The more he observed, the more he realized that the neighborhood wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Behind the manicured lawns and pristine houses, there were secrets. Secrets that only the most observant could uncover. A neighbor's casual glance, a hurried conversation behind closed doors, a strange delivery that was never mentioned. Each of these small moments felt like a piece of the puzzle, but they didn't fit together yet. He couldn't make the connection. The agent couldn't afford to make mistakes. He had to stay one step ahead, constantly analyzing every action, every word, every movement. It was exhausting, trying to keep up the facade of a normal neighbor while simultaneously hunting for clues. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't let his guard down. The slightest misstep could lead to the criminal slipping away unnoticed. As the days passed, the agent grew more determined. He wasn't just looking for obvious evidence anymore. He was looking for the subtle hidden signs that would lead him to the truth. And then, one day, he noticed something that made his heart race. A neighbor, who he had always thought of as harmless, was acting strangely. He was always outside at odd hours, always looking over his shoulder, as if he was trying to avoid being seen. The agent's pulse quickened. This was it, the break he had been waiting for. He started to shadow the neighbor, keeping his distance, blending into the background. The more he watched, the more certain he became that this man knew something. But what? The agent couldn't yet make the connection, but he was closer than ever. Each new discovery, each tiny detail, brought him closer to the truth. But with every step forward, the danger grew. The agent had to be careful. One wrong move, and the criminal could vanish into the shadows, leaving him with nothing but more questions. The tension was building. The agent was no longer just investigating a heist. He was hunting for a criminal who might be living right under his nose. The stakes were higher than ever, and the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous the game became. As the agent dug deeper into his investigation, he began to notice things that, at first glance, seemed harmless, but, upon closer inspection, were anything but. His instincts, honed over years of experience, were telling him that something was off. It was the little things, the red flags, that had slipped under the radar of others, but screamed for attention to someone trained to notice them. The first red flag appeared in the form of one of his neighbors, Mr. Johnson, a man who had always seemed like the model citizen, friendly, outgoing, always willing to lend a hand. But recently, something had changed. The agent had noticed that Mr. Johnson had been spending an unusual amount of time in his garage, always with the door closed. He would disappear into the space for hours at a time, and when he emerged, he always seemed hurried, as if he were trying to avoid being seen. The agent had passed by the house several times and had seen Mr. Johnson glancing nervously over his shoulder, making sure no one was watching. At first, the agent brushed it off. People had their quirks, right? But then he started to notice something else. Mr. Johnson's car. It was always parked in the same spot, but more often than not, it was parked late at night, long after the neighborhood had settled into silence. And when the agent happened to glance at it, he noticed the trunk was slightly ajar, as though someone had been rummaging through it in a hurry. The agent made a mental note. He needed to keep an eye on Mr. Johnson. Another red flag came from the Davis family, who lived 2 doors down. They were a quiet couple, always keeping to themselves. But recently, the agent had observed odd behavior. The wife, Mrs. Davis, had been receiving a steady stream of deliveries at odd hours, late at night or early in the morning, none of which seemed to be for her. The packages were always large, and there was never any explanation. The agent couldn't help but wonder if these deliveries were connected to the heist. Were they a cover for something more sinister? Then there was the strange behavior of the Andersons, a young couple who had just moved into the neighborhood. They had been friendly at first, but over the past few weeks, their actions had become increasingly erratic. The husband, in particular, had been acting nervous, constantly glancing around as if he were afraid of being watched. The agent had caught him several times, looking out of the window, scanning the street, and when he noticed the agent walking by, he quickly ducked out of sight. The wife, too, seemed unusually jumpy, always avoiding eye contact and speaking in hushed tones whenever anyone came by. It was as if they were hiding something or someone. But the most troubling red flag came from the neighbor who lived directly across the street, Mr. Harris. The agent had always found him to be a bit of an enigma, but recently his behavior had grown increasingly suspicious. Mr. Harris had been acting strangely for weeks, always looking over his shoulder when walking around the neighborhood, as if he were expecting someone to be following him. But what caught the agent's attention the most was the odd pattern of movement in and out of his house. Mr. Harris would leave at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, and return hours later, looking disheveled and nervous. The agent couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Harris was hiding something important. Each of these behaviors, these small, seemingly insignificant actions, started to form a pattern in the agent's mind. The neighborhood, once so peaceful and predictable, was now filled with red flags. The agent had always trusted his gut, and it was telling him that one of these neighbors, or perhaps all of them, were hiding something. But what? And more importantly, who could he trust? The agent knew that these overlooked details could be the key to solving the case, but he also knew that he had to be careful. If he made the wrong move, if he confronted the wrong person, it could blow the entire investigation. Every step had to be calculated. Every interaction had to be measured. The red flags were everywhere, but the agent had to find the one that would lead him to the truth. And as the tension built, he realized that the most dangerous part of this investigation wasn't the criminal. It was the people he thought he knew. The agent's heart raced as he pieced together the growing evidence. What had started as a few overlooked details had now turned into a web of suspicion, and the more he investigated, the more one neighbor stood out. At first, he had dismissed him as an unlikely suspect, a man who seemed as harmless as any other. But now, the mounting evidence was beginning to point in his direction, and the agent couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting closer to the truth. It started with the small things, the late-night car trips, the hurried conversations, the odd deliveries. But the more the agent watched, the more those small things began to add up. Mr. Johnson, the seemingly friendly neighbor, had been acting strange for weeks. The agent had observed him more closely now, following him on his daily routine, trying to remain unnoticed. Mr. Johnson's movements were becoming more erratic. He would leave his house at odd hours, always looking over his shoulder as if he feared someone was watching him. And when he returned, he seemed more agitated, his eyes darting around as though he were trying to make sure no one had noticed his comings and goings. But it wasn't just Mr. Johnson's behavior that was raising red flags. The agent had started to notice something else, something far more troubling. The garage. It was always closed when Mr. Johnson was home, but when the agent passed by, he would sometimes hear faint sounds coming from inside, like the clinking of metal or the scraping of something heavy being moved. The agent had been trained to notice these things, and the sounds didn't sit right with him. He had to know what was going on behind that closed door. One afternoon, the agent decided to take a risk. He had noticed that Mr. Johnson had left the house again, and this time, the garage door was slightly ajar. Without hesitation, the agent approached, careful to stay out of sight. He crept closer to the opening, his heart pounding in his chest. What if he was wrong? What if he was just imagining things? But then, as he peered inside, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, in the corner of the garage, was a large, heavy duffel bag, too large to be anything ordinary. The agent's breath caught in his throat as he realized what it could be. Cash. Stolen money. The same kind of money that had gone missing in the heist. His mind raced, piecing together the evidence he had gathered over the past few weeks. The late-night trips, the strange behavior, the garage, everything was pointing to Mr. Johnson. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle that needed to fall into place. The agent couldn't act on just a hunch. He needed more. He needed concrete proof. So, he waited. Days passed, and the tension continued to build. Every time Mr. Johnson left the house, the agent was there, watching, waiting for the right moment. And then, one evening, it happened. Mr. Johnson made a rare mistake. He left the garage door open, just a crack, and the agent could see inside clearly. This time, there was no doubt. The duffel bag was gone, but in its place was a stack of bills, each one carefully wrapped and secured. The agent's pulse quickened. This was it, the evidence he needed. He was certain now Mr. Johnson was involved in the heist. But as the agent stood there, staring at the stack of cash, a chilling thought crossed his mind. What if he was wrong? What if Mr. Johnson wasn't the one behind the crime? The agent had seen the signs, but they could all be part of an elaborate ruse, a carefully crafted illusion designed to mislead him. The tension was unbearable. He had come so far, but now he had to make a choice. Confront Mr. Johnson and risk blowing his cover, or continue watching and gather more evidence. Either way, the agent knew one thing for certain. This investigation was far from over, and the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. The mounting evidence pointed directly toward Mr. Johnson, but there was still one question left unanswered. Was he the mastermind, or was he just another pawn in a much larger game? The agent had to find out, but with every passing moment, the stakes grew higher, and the risk of being discovered became more real. The pressure was mounting, and the agent had to make his move before it was too late. Mr. Johnson had always been the kind of neighbor you'd wave to from across the street, a man who blended into the background with ease. He wasn't particularly loud or outgoing, but he wasn't distant either. He kept to himself, mowed his lawn on Saturdays, and occasionally chatted with others at the local coffee shop. In the eyes of the neighborhood, he was just another face in the crowd, a regular guy living a regular life. But the more the agent observed, the more he began to question that image. Beneath Mr. Johnson's calm exterior, there was something darker, something hidden. The agent had initially dismissed him as an unlikely suspect, but now, with every new piece of evidence, the doubts began to grow. Mr. Johnson's every move seemed calculated, as if he were playing a part in a much larger scheme. He wasn't just the quiet neighbor he appeared to be. He was someone with a secret, and that secret was becoming harder to ignore. The agent had spent weeks watching him, studying his every action. Mr. Johnson's routine was almost too perfect, too predictable. He always left the house at precisely the same time each morning, a briefcase in hand, and returned at the same hour every evening, never deviating from the pattern. But it was the subtle changes that caught the agent's attention. The way Mr. Johnson would glance nervously over his shoulder when walking down the street. The way he would quickly close the blinds whenever someone passed by his window. It was as if he were trying to hide something, trying to make sure no one was watching. And then there was the garage. The agent had been able to confirm that something was happening behind those closed doors. It wasn't just the occasional clink of metal or the sound of heavy objects being moved. It was the way Mr. Johnson acted when he thought no one was looking. He was careful, meticulous even, as though every action was part of a carefully orchestrated plan. The agent had seen him more than once, loading something into the trunk of his car with a sense of urgency, as if he were trying to cover his tracks. But the most unsettling part of all was the way Mr. Johnson seemed to vanish. There were times when the agent would watch his house, and suddenly, Mr. Johnson would be gone, leaving no trace behind. It wasn't just a quick errand or a trip to the store. It was as if he were disappearing into thin air, only to return hours later, looking tired and disoriented, as if he had been somewhere far away. The agent's suspicions grew with each passing day. Mr. Johnson wasn't just a man with a secret. He was a man with a hidden agenda. But what was it? Was he involved in the heist? Or was he simply a pawn in someone else's game? The agent didn't have all the answers yet. But one thing was certain. Mr. Johnson was no ordinary neighbor. He was someone who had carefully crafted an image of normalcy, someone who knew how to hide in plain sight. The more the agent uncovered, the more he realized that the man he had once thought of as harmless was anything but. Mr. Johnson had a past, and that past was beginning to catch up with him. But what was the connection to the heist? And how far was Mr. Johnson willing to go to protect his secrets? The agent knew he was getting closer, but the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous the situation became. Mr. Johnson had played his part well, but the agent was starting to see through the facade. Now, it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light, and when it did, it would shake the foundation of the neighborhood to its core. The agent knew that to solve this case, he couldn't rely on instinct alone. The stakes were too high, and the risks too great. He had to use every tool at his disposal, every resource, every piece of technology, to gather the evidence he needed. His mind raced with possibilities as he set his plan into motion, determined to bring the truth to light without tipping off his neighbors. First, the agent turned to surveillance. He had already been observing Mr. Johnson's movements for weeks, but now it was time to step up his game. He placed discreet cameras in key locations around the neighborhood, hidden in the trees, on streetlights, even on his own property, positioned in such a way that they could capture any suspicious activity near Mr. Johnson's house. The cameras were small, barely noticeable, and they fed footage directly to the agent's phone, allowing him to monitor the neighborhood in real time. He could now see everything: the comings and goings, the late-night trips, the brief exchanges with mysterious figures, all without leaving his home. But surveillance alone wasn't enough. The agent needed more than just video footage. He needed hard evidence. He had connections within the local police department, people who owed him favors, and he wasn't afraid to use them. He reached out to a trusted contact in the forensics unit, requesting a thorough background check on Mr. Johnson. It didn't take long before the agent had a full dossier on his neighbor's history. Everything from his criminal record, or lack thereof, to any financial irregularities that might indicate foul play. What stood out, however, was Mr. Johnson's connections. On paper, he appeared to be just another middle-class man, living in a quiet suburban home. But as the agent dug deeper, he uncovered a series of transactions that raised questions. Large, unexplained deposits in Mr. Johnson's bank account, wire transfers to offshore accounts, and several recent meetings with individuals who had no clear connection to him. The agent's gut told him this wasn't just a case of financial mismanagement. It was part of something bigger. The agent knew that he needed to keep a close watch on Mr. Johnson's communications as well. With the help of a tech specialist friend, he was able to tap into the suspect's phone and email accounts. It wasn't illegal, at least not for someone with the agent's clearance, but it still felt invasive. The agent sifted through text messages, emails, and phone logs, looking for anything that might link Mr. Johnson to the heist. And then, just as he had hoped, he found something. A series of encrypted messages between Mr. Johnson and an unknown contact, discussing plans to move large sums of money and avoid detection. The agent couldn't make out the full content, but it was enough to confirm his suspicions. Mr. Johnson was involved in something illegal. The agent's next move was to track Mr. Johnson's movements in real time. Using a GPS tracking device, he was able to monitor the location of Mr. Johnson's car. It wasn't long before the agent noticed a pattern. Mr. Johnson's trips always seemed to coincide with certain locations, all of them within a few miles of the heist site. The agent couldn't ignore the connection. It was becoming clear that Mr. Johnson had been in the area during the time of the robbery. But the agent wasn't done yet. He needed to gather physical evidence, something that would tie Mr. Johnson directly to the crime. He decided to follow him one night, waiting until Mr. Johnson left his house for one of his usual late-night trips. This time, the agent was ready. He followed at a safe distance, keeping his car hidden in the shadows as he tracked Mr. Johnson to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. The agent's heart raced as he watched Mr. Johnson pull into the lot, his headlights briefly illuminating a large metal door. The warehouse was abandoned, a perfect location for someone trying to avoid detection. The agent waited for what felt like hours, watching from a distance, his eyes never leaving the warehouse. Finally, Mr. Johnson emerged from the building, carrying a large duffel bag. The agent's pulse quickened. He knew this was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He couldn't risk confronting Mr. Johnson now, not without solid proof. Instead, he snapped a few quick photos, documenting the bag and its contents as best he could from his vantage point. As Mr. Johnson drove away, the agent knew that he was getting closer to the truth. The technology, the surveillance, the resources, everything was falling into place. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle to uncover. What was in the bag? And how did it connect to the $1 million heist? The agent's investigation was far from over, but with each new piece of evidence, he could feel the walls closing in on his suspect. The technology had given him the edge he needed, but it was his determination, his ability to read between the lines, that would ultimately bring the case to a close. The tension was palpable as the agent closed in on his suspect. The investigation had reached a boiling point, and every step he took seemed to bring him closer to the truth. But with each new discovery, the danger intensified. Mr. Johnson had become aware of the agent's presence, even if he didn't know exactly who was watching him. The agent could feel the walls tightening around him as the cat-and-mouse game escalated, each move becoming more calculated, more desperate. The agent had already uncovered so much: Mr. Johnson's suspicious behavior, the strange deliveries, the cryptic messages, and the late-night trips. But now, with the warehouse incident fresh in his mind, he knew he was on the verge of something huge. Every detail he had uncovered was pointing to one undeniable conclusion: Mr. Johnson was involved in the heist. But the question remained: how deep did it go? Was he the mastermind, or was he just another pawn in a larger operation? The agent's every instinct told him to move in, to make the arrest and end the investigation once and for all. but something held him back. Mr. Johnson was smart, too smart. He had been careful, meticulous even, in covering his tracks. The agent couldn't afford to make a mistake, not now. One wrong move, and the suspect could slip away, leaving him with nothing but a trail of breadcrumbs and unanswered questions. It was a dangerous game, and the stakes had never been higher. The agent had been tracking Mr. Johnson's every move, but now it felt like the tables were turning. Mr. Johnson had started to change his routine, as if he knew someone was watching. The agent had noticed it in the way he would glance over his shoulder, the way he would take longer routes to avoid certain streets, the way he began to cover his tracks. It was as if Mr. Johnson was aware of the agent's investigation, and he was starting to play his own game. The cat-and-mouse chase had begun. The agent had to stay one step ahead. He continued to follow Mr. Johnson, but now he had to be more careful than ever. Every corner, every turn, every street became a potential trap. The agent knew that if he was too obvious, if he made a single mistake, Mr. Johnson would disappear, and the investigation would be over. But he couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let the man who had orchestrated the heist slip through his fingers. It wasn't just about catching the criminal anymore. It was about survival. The agent could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The chase was no longer just about evidence. It was about the psychological battle between him and his suspect. The agent had to outsmart Mr. Johnson, anticipate his every move, and be ready for whatever tricks he might have up his sleeve. One evening, the agent's heart skipped a beat as he saw Mr. Johnson leaving his house again. But this time, something was different. He wasn't alone. There was another man with him, a tall figure the agent didn't recognize. They exchanged a few quick words before getting into a black SUV and driving off in the direction of the warehouse. The agent's mind raced. Was this the person Mr. Johnson had been meeting with? The mastermind behind the heist? Or was it just another part of the plan? The agent followed them, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. He kept a safe distance, careful not to alert them to his presence. As they approached the warehouse, the agent's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He parked his car a few blocks away, watching as the SUV pulled into the lot. Mr. Johnson and his companion got out, each carrying a duffel bag, and disappeared into the building. The agent waited, knowing he couldn't rush in. He needed to be patient. He needed to wait for the right moment. Every second felt like an eternity as he watched the warehouse, his eyes fixed on the entrance. He knew that one wrong move could ruin everything, but the pressure was mounting. The more time he spent watching, the more he could feel the tension building, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Suddenly, the warehouse door opened, and Mr. Johnson and his companion emerged, empty-handed. The agent's heart sank. Had he missed his chance? Had they already moved the evidence? He had to know for sure. With his breath held, the agent crept closer, staying in the shadows as he approached the building. He couldn't afford to be seen, not now. Just as he reached the edge of the lot, the agent heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, his heart racing, but it was too late. Mr. Johnson had seen him. The agent's pulse pounded in his ears as he quickly ducked behind a nearby dumpster, trying to stay out of sight. The game had changed. Now, it was a race against time. Mr. Johnson's footsteps grew louder as he neared, and the agent knew he had only moments before he was discovered. Every instinct told him to move, to run, but he stayed frozen, his eyes fixed on the warehouse. The tension was unbearable, and with every passing second, the stakes grew higher. Would he catch his suspect, or would Mr. Johnson slip away into the night, leaving the agent with nothing but the haunting feeling of being one step behind. The cat-and-mouse chase had reached its climax, and the agent was about to make his move. The night air felt thick with tension as the agent crouched in the shadows, heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps approaching, growing louder by the second. His eyes remained fixed on the warehouse entrance, where Mr. Johnson and his mysterious companion had just emerged. The agent's mind raced. This was the moment. Everything he had worked for, every piece of evidence, every hour of surveillance had led to this confrontation. He waited, barely breathing, as the footsteps drew closer. Suddenly, the shadow of Mr. Johnson loomed in front of him, the agent's pulse quickening. Without thinking, he sprang into action, leaping from his hiding spot and blocking the path, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. Mr. Johnson froze, his eyes widening in shock as the agent stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "Don't move," the agent commanded, his gaze fixed on Mr. Johnson. "I know what you've been up to." For a moment, there was silence, only the sound of distant traffic and the wind rustling through the trees. Mr. Johnson stood motionless, his face pale, as if trying to process the agent's sudden appearance. But then, something shifted in his expression, a flash of recognition, followed by a flicker of defiance. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" Mr. Johnson said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "You think you can just waltz in here and ruin everything?" The agent's grip tightened on his gun, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "I know about the heist, the money, the warehouse. It all leads back to you." Mr. Johnson scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You don't get it, do you? I wasn't the one behind the heist. I'm just a middleman, a pawn in someone else's game. The real mastermind is someone you'll never expect." The agent's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about? You've been moving money, meeting with people in the shadows. You've been involved in everything from the start." Mr. Johnson shook his head, his face hardening. "I didn't have a choice. They came to me, threatened my family. I had no way out. I'm not the criminal here. I'm just the one who got caught in the middle." The agent's mind raced. He had suspected there was more to this than met the eye, but he hadn't expected this. Mr. Johnson wasn't the mastermind? Was it possible that he had been used, manipulated by someone else? The agent's instincts told him there was more to the story, but time was running out. He couldn't let Mr. Johnson slip away without knowing the full truth. "Who's behind this?" the agent demanded, his voice rising with urgency. "Who's pulling the strings?" For a moment, Mr. Johnson hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. But then, with a resigned sigh, he spoke. "It's someone you know, someone close to you, someone who's been hiding in plain sight all along." The agent's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" Mr. Johnson's lips curled into a grim smile. "You'll find out soon enough. But by then, it'll be too late." Before the agent could react, Mr. Johnson lunged forward, knocking the agent off balance. In an instant, the agent was on the ground, disoriented, as Mr. Johnson scrambled to his feet and bolted for the warehouse. The agent's head spun, but he quickly regained his bearings, pushing himself up and sprinting after him. He couldn't let him get away. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. As he neared the warehouse, the agent could hear Mr. Johnson's footsteps echoing in the empty space ahead. The agent was almost there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, when suddenly, the sound of a car engine roared to life. The agent skidded to a halt, his eyes darting to the side. A black SUV was speeding toward the warehouse, its headlights blinding in the dark. Mr. Johnson had made a break for it, and now he was being picked up by someone else, someone who was part of the operation. The agent's mind raced as he calculated his next move. He couldn't let the suspect escape again. With a burst of adrenaline, he ran toward the SUV, his hand reaching for his gun. But just as he was about to make his move, the vehicle screeched to a halt, and the driver's side door flew open. A tall figure stepped out, someone the agent had never expected to see. It was his own partner. The agent's blood ran cold. His partner, the one he had trusted, the one who had been by his side through every step of this investigation, was the mastermind behind the heist. The agent's mind reeled, unable to process the betrayal. He had been played, manipulated, just like Mr. Johnson. "Surprised?" his partner said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You should have known. You were never going to catch me." The agent stood frozen, his hand still gripping his gun, but his entire world had just shattered. The chase was over, but the truth was far worse than he could have ever imagined. His partner, the one person he had trusted more than anyone else, had been the one pulling the strings all along. And now, the agent was left with nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal and the knowledge that the real mastermind had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The agent's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of betrayal heavy on his shoulders. His partner, his closest ally, stood before him, the smirk on his face now replaced by cold, calculating eyes. The truth had come crashing down like a tidal wave, and the agent was left standing in the wreckage of his own trust. His mind was a blur, struggling to process what had just been revealed. His partner was the mastermind behind the heist, the person he had shared countless hours with, the one who had helped him piece together every clue, was the very one he had been chasing. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The agent's hand tightened around his gun, his fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the shock of betrayal. He had never suspected his partner, never imagined that the man who had worked by his side was capable of orchestrating something so elaborate, so dangerous. But there was no time to dwell on the shock. The moment of truth had arrived. The agent knew what he had to do. With a swift motion, he raised his gun, his voice cutting through the tension. "Step back. Put your hands where I can see them." The agent's partner didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hands slowly, a mockery of surrender. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice smooth and calm, as if the agent hadn't just uncovered his deepest secret. "You don't know the whole story. You don't know what's at stake here." The agent's jaw tightened. "I know enough. You're under arrest for the $1 million heist. You've been manipulating everything from the start." His partner's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no humor in it, only the cold arrogance of someone who thought they were untouchable. "You think you can stop me now? You're too late." But the agent wasn't listening anymore. The moment had come, and he wasn't about to let his partner slip away. He took a step forward, his eyes locked onto his partner's, the tension between them thickening with every passing second. "You're done," the agent said, his voice low and steady. "The game's over." In an instant, the agent moved with precision, his hand gripping his partner's arm and twisting it behind his back. The suspect winced, but didn't resist. The agent could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he didn't hesitate. He knew this was the only way to end it, to bring the person responsible for the heist to justice. "Hands behind your back," the agent ordered, his voice unwavering. His partner didn't protest. The agent cuffed him swiftly, his movements sharp and efficient. The sound of the cuffs clicking into place echoed in the quiet night, a sharp reminder of the finality of the situation. As the agent stepped back, his partner glared at him, his face twisted with anger and resentment. "You think this changes anything?" His partner spat. "You think you've won?" The agent met his gaze without flinching. "It's over. You're going to prison, and there's nothing you can do about it." The agent's mind was still reeling from the revelation, but he knew he had done what needed to be done. He had followed the trail of clues, uncovered the hidden truths, and brought the mastermind to justice. The weight of the arrest was heavy, but there was a strange sense of relief in knowing that the case was finally closed. As the agent walked his partner toward the waiting squad car, the cold night air seemed to press in around them. The agent's mind was a whirlwind, still processing everything that had just happened. His partner, his trusted friend, had been the one pulling the strings all along. But now, that betrayal was behind him. The agent had done his job. He had brought the criminal to justice, no matter the cost. The suspect was loaded into the car, and the agent stood there for a moment, watching as the vehicle pulled away. The case was over, but the emotional toll of the investigation had just begun to sink in. The agent had learned a hard lesson, that trust could be a fragile thing, and sometimes the ones closest to you were the ones you had to watch the most. But in the end, justice had been served. The agent had done what he set out to do, and the $1 million heist was finally solved. The aftermath of the heist rippled through the community like a stone dropped in a still pond, sending waves of shock and disbelief through the quiet neighborhood. For weeks, whispers filled the air as residents tried to make sense of what had happened in their own backyard. The idea that the very person they had trusted, someone they had lived beside, shared casual conversations with, and considered a friend, was behind a $1 million heist was unfathomable. The agent had always known that the truth would have a profound effect, but seeing the community react to the revelation was something else entirely. Neighbors who had once greeted each other with smiles and friendly waves now exchanged wary glances, their trust shattered. The streets, once filled with the hum of everyday life, seemed quieter, more cautious. The sense of security that had once defined the neighborhood was gone, replaced by a palpable unease. People locked their doors a little tighter at night, and conversations were held in hushed tones, as if the shadow of the heist still loomed over them. But amidst the uncertainty, there was also a sense of relief. The arrest of the mastermind, agent's own partner, had brought a measure of closure, not just to the case, but to the community that had been unknowingly living under the influence of a criminal. The agent's work, while painful and personal, had ultimately restored a sense of justice. The stolen money was recovered, and the heist was no longer a mystery, its secrets laid bare for all to see. In the weeks that followed, the agent watched as the neighborhood slowly began to heal. People returned to their routines, but there was an underlying tension, a lingering awareness that things would never be quite the same. The agent, too, felt the weight of the case on his shoulders, the consequences of betrayal still fresh in his mind. But as the dust settled, he knew that justice had been served. The courts moved quickly, and the mastermind was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The agent's partner, the one person he had trusted above all else, was now behind bars, facing the consequences of his actions. The betrayal had been deep, but the justice system had done its job. The community, while scarred, could now move forward, knowing that the person responsible for the heist was no longer a threat. For the agent, the case was over, but the emotional toll would linger. He had lost more than just a suspect. He had lost a friend, a colleague, someone he had once trusted with his life. The betrayal had shaken him to his core, but it had also reinforced the harsh reality of the world he lived in. In his line of work, trust was a rare commodity, and even those closest to you could harbor secrets that would shatter everything you thought you knew. As the community began to rebuild, the agent couldn't help but reflect on the cost of justice. It had been a hard-earned victory, one that came at a personal price. But in the end, the truth had prevailed. The heist was solved, the mastermind was caught, and the community was slowly finding its way back to normalcy. Yet, as the agent walked through the streets of the neighborhood, he couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed forever. The heist had left a scar on the community, one that would take time to heal. And for the agent, the memory of the case would linger, a constant reminder of the fine line between trust and betrayal, and the high price of justice. The agent stood alone on the balcony of his apartment, staring out over the neighborhood that had once felt like a safe haven. The familiar sights, the quiet streets, the neatly manicured lawns, the houses that had always seemed so secure, now appeared different to him. The million-dollar heist, the betrayal of his partner, and the subsequent arrest had changed everything. As the agent reflected on the case, he realized that it wasn't just the money that had been stolen, but the very sense of trust and safety that had once defined the community. In his line of work, the agent had always been vigilant. He had learned to spot the smallest of details, the subtle shifts in behavior, the hidden clues that others might overlook. But this case had taught him a painful lesson. Sometimes, the most dangerous threats came from the places you least expected. His partner, the one person he had trusted implicitly, had been the mastermind behind the heist. And while the agent had followed the trail of evidence to its inevitable conclusion, the emotional toll of the betrayal was something he hadn't anticipated. The agent had spent years building a reputation for being meticulous, for being able to see through the surface and uncover the truth. But in this case, the truth had been buried so deeply within the very people he had worked alongside that it had taken him far longer than it should have to recognize it. He couldn't help but wonder how many other communities, like his own, were living under the illusion of safety, unaware that danger could be lurking just around the corner, hidden behind the most familiar faces. As he looked out at the neighborhood, the agent realized how crucial it was for communities to remain vigilant, not just in the physical sense, but in terms of the relationships they formed and the trust they placed in others. People often believed that the dangers of the world were distant, that crime and betrayal happened to other people, in other places. But the reality was far different. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild, and the scars left behind by betrayal could take years to heal. The agent had seen the damage firsthand. The community, once tight-knit and full of camaraderie, had been fractured by the revelation of the heist. Neighbors now eyed each other with suspicion, unsure of who they could trust. The agent understood that this was the collateral damage of the case, the invisible consequences that couldn't be measured in arrests or convictions. It was a reminder that the true cost of crime wasn't just the loss of money or property, but the erosion of the very fabric that held a community together. But as much as the agent felt the weight of the case, he also recognized the importance of vigilance. It was easy to let down your guard when things seemed normal, when life followed its predictable rhythm. But that was when the most dangerous threats could slip through the cracks. The agent had learned that even in the safest of places, vigilance was essential. The people around you, the ones you trusted, the ones you lived alongside, could be hiding secrets that could unravel everything you thought you knew. The case had taught him that vigilance wasn't just about looking for the obvious signs of trouble. It was about being aware of the subtle shifts, the small inconsistencies, the things that didn't quite add up. It was about questioning what seemed too perfect, too familiar, and never taking anything at face value. And perhaps most importantly, it was about recognizing that no one was immune from betrayal, not even the people closest to you. As the agent turned away from the balcony and walked back inside, he knew that the case had changed him. He would never look at his community the same way again. The lessons he had learned about trust, betrayal, and the importance of vigilance would stay with him for the rest of his career. But he also knew that the work wasn't over. The world was full of hidden dangers, and it was his job to find them, no matter where they were. The agent had learned the hard way that the cost of justice was often higher than expected. But in the end, it was a price he was willing to pay. The truth had been uncovered, the criminal had been caught, and the community, though scarred, could begin to heal. And with that, the agent knew one thing for sure. No matter how ordinary a place seemed, or how trustworthy the people around him appeared to be, he would always remain vigilant. Because in his line of work, the truth was often buried beneath layers of deception, and it was up to him to uncover it, no matter the cost. The agent sat at his desk, the weight of the case still pressing on his mind. The arrest had been made, the heist solved, and justice had been served. Yet, as he reflected on everything that had transpired, one thought kept coming back to him: the value of trust. It was a concept he had always known to be important, but never had he realized just how fragile and essential it truly was until the case had unfolded. Trust wasn't just a part of his job. It was the foundation of every relationship, every investigation, and every piece of evidence he uncovered. In the world of law enforcement, trust was everything. The agent had trusted his partner, someone he had worked alongside for years, someone who had shared the same goals and values. They had built a bond over time, forged through countless hours spent together, solving cases and protecting their community. But when that trust was broken, when the agent discovered that his partner had been the mastermind behind the heist, it felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. The betrayal wasn't just a personal blow. It was a reminder that trust could be shattered in an instant, and once broken, it was almost impossible to rebuild. The agent knew that trust was a delicate thing. It had to be earned, nurtured, and protected. But it was also something that could be taken for granted. When things seemed normal, when life followed its predictable course, it was easy to overlook the small clues, the subtle signs that something was amiss. And yet, it was those very clues that often held the key to uncovering the truth. In the case of the heist, the agent had missed those clues at first. Small inconsistencies, odd behaviors, things that didn't quite add up. He had trusted his partner without question, and in doing so, he had allowed himself to overlook the subtle red flags that were right in front of him. As the agent thought back to the investigation, he realized how crucial it was to recognize those small details, the things that others might dismiss as insignificant. In his line of work, every detail mattered. Every glance, every word, every action could be a clue that led to the truth. The agent had learned that building relationships wasn't just about forging bonds. It was about paying attention to the nuances, the subtle shifts in behavior that could signal something deeper. Trust wasn't just about believing in someone's words. It was about observing their actions, their patterns, and their motives. But trust wasn't just about recognizing the clues in others. It was also about trusting yourself. The agent had learned to rely on his instincts, to follow his gut when something didn't feel right. There were times in the investigation when he had second-guessed himself, when he had wondered if he was just being paranoid. But in the end, it was his instincts that had guided him to the truth. It was his ability to recognize the subtle clues and his willingness to question the things that seemed too perfect that had led him to uncover the betrayal. The agent knew that trust wasn't something that could be given freely. It had to be earned. But once it was broken, it was nearly impossible to repair. He had learned that lesson the hard way, and while it had shaken him to his core, it had also made him more vigilant, more aware of the importance of building genuine relationships. In the future, he would approach every relationship with caution, always looking for the subtle clues that might reveal the truth. In the end, the agent understood that trust was both a gift and a responsibility. It was something that had to be nurtured, respected, and protected. And while betrayal could leave deep scars, it was also a reminder of just how important it was to build relationships based on honesty, integrity, and mutual respect. The agent had learned that the key to solving any case, whether it was a million-dollar heist or a personal betrayal, wasn't just about following the evidence. It was about understanding the value of trust, recognizing the subtle clues that others might miss, and always staying vigilant, no matter how familiar the faces around you might seem. As the agent looked out the window, the neighborhood once again appeared calm, but he knew that trust, like everything else, was fragile. He had learned that the hard way, and he would never forget the lessons the case had taught him. Trust was the foundation of everything, and it was something that had to be earned, protected, and never taken for granted. As the case came to a close, the agent couldn't help but reflect on the importance of vigilance, not just for law enforcement, but for every single person within a community. The heist had been a wake-up call, a stark reminder that danger could be closer than we think, and sometimes the most unsuspecting people could be hiding secrets that put everyone at risk. Now, more than ever, it's crucial to stay aware of your surroundings. The smallest detail, the most insignificant behavior, could be the key to preventing something far worse. If something doesn't feel right, if you notice something unusual or suspicious, don't ignore it. Speak up. Report it. Your awareness could make all the difference. Communities thrive on trust, but trust alone isn't enough. Vigilance is what keeps us safe. It's what helps uncover the truth before it's too late. The agent's story is a reminder that we all have a role to play in keeping our neighborhoods safe, and sometimes that means being the one to notice what others might overlook. So, take a moment to reflect on your surroundings. Trust your instincts, stay alert, and if you see something that doesn't add up, don't hesitate to report it. We all have a part to play in making our communities safer. Stay vigilant, stay aware, and together, we can prevent the next crime before it even begins.